So anytime you're investigating something, you can generally break it up into different layers of analysis. And I want to talk a little bit about that with regards to Jiu-Jitsu today, because oftentimes people will talk sort of past each other when they're trying to decipher something in Jiu-Jitsu and they're trying to really figure out what's going on. One person might be focused on the technical precision of some set of mechanics, and another person is focused on what's the proper technique, let's say, in one moment versus another. Both of them having sort of legitimate things they're investigating, but maybe not having a way of putting it into a useful context. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And I brought over some belts because I think that you can probably break up the different layers of analysis of Jiu-Jitsu according to belt, not because they're hard and fast rules, but because the layers of analysis can coincide with sort of a layering on top of that occurs as you gain more experience in the sport. And so I'll sort of describe each of these layers, and by the end we'll sort of have an understanding of the topic on the whole. Okay, so obviously first one would be white belt. And at white belt, really what we're looking at is just awareness. Okay, and the example I like to use is if there was a white belt in swimming, the awareness would be, are you drowning or are you not drowning? And once you discover which of those categories you're in, then you can get a little bit better at the thing called swimming. But if you're not sure when you're drowning, it's very hard to add on the mechanics of swimming. So, pretty easy thing to do. Am I drowning or not? And in Jiu-Jitsu, we can detail this out more or less fully depending on what's appropriate. So the first thing might be, am I in a position where I should probably tap? Am I in a submission? And at white belt, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes there's just so much discomfort and body pressure that you might tap, and it's not a submission. You see how I do this thing right here? This means, you know, that. And I'm doing the thing with your fingers, quoting it. Maybe you're not sure, but you tap, and so that's fine. It's not something you should be concerned about, but you do want to start investigating what are submissions, and understanding that an arm lock is not generally something that breaks your humerus or breaks the bones in your forearm. That is possible, but generally arm locks will refer to something that attacks the elbow joint. And then you'll at some point investigate the difference between strangulations and chokes. You'll understand the difference between side mount and the full mount, and you'll sometimes see people getting a little bit tripped up over their own words when they talk about, they'll use terms like, you know, if we start from side guard or something, you know, things that later on, when you understand the reference side and the reference guard, you'll have trouble sort of adding those together in a sensible way, and that's a good thing, because we don't want to be vague or ambiguous with the terms that we use, especially when we have time constraints like Jiu-Jitsu, and we really have to be able to take instruction and act under pressure. So awareness is actually a pretty big step, and it's something you continually return to as you go into the deeper layers of the sport. You'll have a sort of renewed awareness or a heightened awareness, or you'll be able to be aware of different things. Just like when you're familiar with any topic, you can hold more complex information about that topic in your mind at the same time. Whereas if something is relatively new for you, even the seemingly easiest portions of it may be a bit too much to handle at some given moment. And there's a lot of other items that are involved in this idea of awareness. I'm sure we'll get back to them as we go forward. But first things first is just awareness. Am I in a submission or not? Am I in X or am I in Y? And how would I differentiate between them? Now, one of the first things that tends to capture people's attention in Jiu-Jitsu is they become aware, let me pull this back into frame for what it is, they become aware of the importance of mechanics. And that would be blue belt here. These are actually my blue purple, brown, and this black belt has kind of a fun story that I'll tell as we get to that. One of the first things that tends to fascinate people is the power of mechanics or technique in Jiu Jitsu, meaning that despite somebody else's maximal resistance, they couldn't help but tap out. Or despite the fact that this person was very athletic or physically strong or in better condition than you, by being efficient with your mechanics, you're able to overcome them. Okay, so if that white belt, we're talking about awareness. Am I in this place or that place? At blue belt, really our focus is on the mechanics. And this is where I really encourage people to focus on taking their time when they're doing static drilling and as best as they can manage to get every single step as sharply refined as possible, which of course brings us back to awareness, because as you learn the steps to, say, an arm lock or a triangle, at first it might seem like it's a 2 to 5 step technique, and you do each of those steps the best you can, and your ability to perceive how correct each one of those steps can be is limited by your limited experience. But then as you continue to do repetitions, and then you go to sparring and you succeed or you fail with those techniques, and you return to static drilling, you have a greater awareness of what those mechanics could potentially have or could potentially hold for you. So again, if you sparred with a variety of different belts, white, blue, purple, brown, black, there's a sense in which a 145, 150 pound black belt can seem so much stronger or just have so much more tensile strength than even an experienced purple belt or brown belt. And a large part of this is going to be their mechanical precision, which would be the depth at which they understand these mechanics of a guard pass or submission and so on. Again, I'm sort of leaving out certain areas that may be obvious to more experienced students, but that is because in large part they fall within these sort of later belt ranks that we'll get into. Okay, so if at white belt we have awareness, which is just, am I in a submission or not? Am I in place A or am I in place B? And at blue belt, we're talking about, well, okay, how do I get to this place over here, or what actually happens in an arm lock? Is it my shoulder? Is it my elbow? What do I need to do? What are the steps involved in doing this specific guard pass so that somebody framing on me is not enough to stop me from passing their guard? If we go to purple belt, I would say that purple belt you could describe as dynamics. Dynamics being the decisions that you make with regards to which mechanics do you use at a given time. And when I first started off talking a few minutes ago, I was talking about 2 students, one of whom may be very interested in the static drilling and the precise mechanics of the given technique, and another student is asking, well, when do I use a bullfighter versus a stack pass, versus when should I try to just jump underneath their hips and take their back in some form of leg drag? And in that latter case, that would be a question about dynamics. You could think of mechanics as individual steps, and dynamics as being groups of those sets, of those steps, so groups of those steps, and choosing between those various groups. So the mechanics of an arm lock would be certain types of grip, certain types of leg movement, and then eventually submission. The mechanics of a triangle might be a different set of grips, a different set of hip movements, resulting in a different submission. And then dynamics would be, how do I use an arm lock in a way where I intend to finish the arm lock, but perhaps I'm ready to move into a triangle if their response necessitates that. Because again, your mechanics may be very, very powerful, very strong, very well practiced in one area, and your training partner might have a very strong awareness of your exact strength, and so they're probably going to be able to avoid singular attacks from you. And so it becomes necessary to pair attacks together so that as A fails, B starts to come in and make up for any failings in the first technique. And again, as you gain more experience, you can hold more of these larger ideas in mind at the same time. So it may be difficult at first to just do an arm lock, again, in static drilling. And then of course it's difficult to do that in sparring. And of course, it may be difficult to do a triangle choke in static drilling. And of course, it's difficult to do in sparring. And then the difficulty is, well, I can kind of do the arm lock and I can kind of do the triangle, but can I bridge the gap between the two so that they become more powerful because of each other's existence? Because the defense against an arm lock gives way to the opening for a triangle, or vice versa, or sometimes altogether. Okay, so again, moving along, but we'll be returning to these same ideas. Brown belt is a very, very interesting belt. The phrase I like to use to describe brown belt, I would call waves, like waves in an ocean. And white belt, again, is awareness, blue belt, mechanics, purple belt, dynamics, and brown belt, waves. What would that mean? Well, if we think of the arm lock as having a certain set of steps, in a triangle, a certain set of steps, and let's say in omoplata, a certain set of steps, around the purple belt level, you're moving between these techniques, and you may move between them with different degrees of comfort or fluidity. Oftentimes at purple belt you see people who are very exceptional guard players and just have a hell of a time trying to pass somebody's guard, or vice versa. They are able to move from one technique to another, and then from that technique to a third. What brown belt is I'm essentially trying to push all of these techniques towards you at the same time. Almost like a wave. Wave. And so as I push the arm lock and the triangle and the omoplata thread at you at the same time, you're trying to play this game of whack-a-mole where you're defending the arm lock, you're defending the triangle, and the omoplata resolves. And so it might seem like I just pushed the omoplata through the whole time. But in fact, it was your sensitivity, your awareness, your understanding of mechanics, your sensitivity to dynamics that allowed you to stop that initial arm lock. And maybe you didn't recognize it consciously, but you avoided that triangle. But you got snagged with an omoplata and you got swept. And so the difference between purple belt and brown belt, I would say, a lot of times can be expressed as through somebody's fundamentals. You don't often see long strings of different techniques where 12 different techniques are done back to back to back to back to back. Instead, it usually comes across as, wow, that brown belt just did the escape that I learned on my first day, and they did it against a purple belt, made it look pretty easy. It's unlikely that the brown belt was just absolutely still and then in one sudden movement did that technique. What's more likely is there are subtle shifts in movement and adjustments in body weight and feints and counter feints that they use in order to sense what their opponent is alert to and what maybe they're a little bit less sensitive to, and then the attack can begin from there. Again, the difference between purple belt and brown belt obviously gets easier to understand as you approach these belts, but you could think of it as purple belt, I'm able to threaten you with different attacks, but those attacks tend to come one at a time. And if I've done a good job at blue belt, each of those singular attacks is quite powerful. My arm lock is refined, my triangle is refined, my omoplata is refined, but at around purple belt I'm still having trouble bringing the arm lock and the triangle to you in a true dilemma, or if we have the omoplata, in a true trilemma. It's really this quick swap where I threaten you with one and then I switch to another. That would be purple belt. Brown belt is I'm pushing the entire arsenal at you at the same time, and you're trying to juggle all of these different defenses, and something finds a way through and bam, the water spills all the way. It only takes a tiny little crack in someone's defense to break through, but it only takes a tiny bit of anticipation to actually defend something to keep in mind. Okay, so yeah, we've just sort of touched on each of these belts, and each one of these is worthy of study in its own way. White belt being awareness, blue belt being mechanics, purple belt is bound up in the idea of dynamics. Brown belt I described as you're essentially creating waves of attack or defense. And then black belt. And the black belt I would describe as cycles, meaning that when you become a black belt, you'll hear a lot of times that people describe it as a sense of starting over, or you get to a level where everyone is essentially expected to be able to beat each other, and so something new is synthesized from you. A lot of times at the junior belts, if a brown belt beats a purple belt, they're both totally fine with that. The purple belt, being a purple belt, will have some expectation perhaps of a brown belt beating them. It's not always the case, but often it is. And a brown belt will often exert themselves a bit more because they understand that their brown piece of cloth that they put around their waist should mean that they should be able to overcome somebody who wears a purple piece of cloth around their waist. And if the symbols that we use are to hold their value, that generally should be the case. And then at black belt, you know, you could have me and you could have my instructor who just turns me into grains of sand and flicks me off like into the ocean, you know. And I don't think of myself as less of a black belt because of that, but I understand that being a black belt involves going through cycles that allow for you to improve almost indefinitely. And so black belt, when I describe it as cycles, what I mean is going through these first 4 stages that I described. So let's take an example. At black belt, let's say you've mostly been a guard player, and so there's some imbalance between your skill as a guard player and your skill as a guard passer. What you'll start to be able to do, and you can do this at the earlier belts, but you must be able to do this at black belt, is you'll be able to examine your best skills, let's say it's guard, playing guard, and use some of those lessons to improve your guard passing. Because you'll understand what are the mechanics necessary to create a viable arm lock threat. How is a transition between an arm lock and a triangle going to be successful or not successful? What kinds of attacks can I tend to bring all at once to my opponent? And therefore, if I'm passing, I should be alert to all of them all at the same time. And I should probably find solutions that eliminate as many of those attacks as possible all at the same time. So one of the actual impediments of black belt, one thing that just really will drag somebody's development, is the fact that they're now a black belt, and that there's a sense perhaps that they should know so much. And so there's a reluctance to engage with unfamiliar topics. A classic example of this is footlocks and leg locks. A little less commonly seen is between guard playing and guard passing, although at the higher levels of competition you definitely still see this expressed. But a black belt will tend to be they become accustomed to having a certain depth of knowledge in certain areas, and when their knowledge, when that depth of knowledge is not expressed in some other area, it's often dismissed as, oh, that's not part of my game, or think of any number of reasons you want. And while it might be true, that's not part of your A game, it should not be something that is inaccessible to you as a black belt. You should be able to see a situation developing between 2 athletes and have some set of tools that allow you to pull apart what's going on and to understand the motivations of the 2 athletes and what would be a couple of good recommendations for both of the athletes involved, what would constitute progress on either end. So instead of perhaps being slowed down or dragging in your development as a black belt, which is very, very common, you can actually accelerate your progress as a black belt if you understand that there are these cycles you're going to have to go through, and that if you go, all right, well, perhaps I'm unfamiliar with leg attacks. I don't necessarily have to be at the stage of dynamics or creating waves of attacks against my opponent. I need to be patient with myself and first go through the awareness step. What are the various attacks that can occur to the legs? What are the mechanics that allow for them to work, and what are the mechanics that cause them to fail? What are the dynamics where one attack at the legs leads to another attack at the legs, or where one attack at the legs leads to an attack at the upper body, or an avenue to the back, or a sweep, and so forth and so on. And so black belt is, as with many things in Jiu Jitsu, a renewal of the same test that you've been going through throughout all of these other stages of Jiu-Jitsu. That being, can you be patient with yourself while you develop that awareness? Often at black belt, people will have expected themselves to have the awareness and will avoid things that are uncomfortable to them because they maybe don't have that awareness. And at white belt, a lot of beginners get frustrated because no one's ever told them that most of what they need to be doing is just understanding up from down and left from right and so forth and so on, and that they don't have to have perfect mechanics. Even if another white belt who has some more experience seems like they have pretty good mechanics, a new student to Jiu-Jitsu doesn't know that people are often white belts for many, many years because of how deep the level of awareness and mechanics by themselves can go. And so at black belt, you've got to be willing to go through the stage of awareness where you enter into essentially what is a blank canvas, and then it starts being populated with different ideas and things that are unfamiliar, and you start mapping the territory a little bit, and you don't begrudge yourself for not being completely fluent with all the different roads and avenues you can take. After you get that awareness, you have to then narrow your focus a bit on some set of mechanics. Now here's a great thing about mechanics in Jiu-Jitsu, is depth of knowledge in one area of mechanics doesn't necessarily translate one for one, but it does have a lot of overlap. Meaning that the example that's coming to mind now is at first students often are drawn towards movements that create linear forces. They pull and they push, or they pull and they push, or whatever it is that they're doing, instead of this sort of unified rotational movement or creating torque that allows for you to control slack. But once you get that sense, once you've gone through some area of study, it could be guard passing, it could be guard playing, it doesn't really matter, and you understand, oh, it's not just push and pull in a straight line, it's push and pull at the same time in order to create a circle, in order to rotate, because my spine allows me to be most powerful when I rotate, not when I simply move in a straight line. Oh, okay, so now if you get a sense of those mechanics as a maybe newly minted black belt, then you can start to be creative and start bringing dynamics into play. And that might be one of the more enjoyable phases, because you're bringing something that you had to earn through this sort of new study of awareness and mechanics, and you get to merge it with some of your existing knowledge, some of the things you're already really good at. And that's where you see a lot of the synthesis that gives rise to sort of big breakthroughs in the sport. You know, when you see things like first, the development of things like the half guard as an offensive position is a sort of older example. More modern example would be how to play the dynamic of a double guard pull, given the rules of how athletes are scored, and the development of things like a berimbolo. And then sort of the unseen X factor that is difficult to appreciate sometimes if you're just a spectator, is the sense of pressure that's developed as people get more comfortable developing sort of these waves of attacks where many things are threatening from many different angles, and it just so happens that visually we perceive one thing resolved, but in actuality those two athletes were one of them was feeling like they're painting themselves into a corner, and the other one was gaining a sort of overwhelming sense of momentum where the outcome just sort of seems inevitable. And then we get back to black belt and we go through the cycles again and again and again, and then at a certain point you start to not so much be finished in any way or removed or distanced from this process, but you start to see how it's an acceptable process to have exist. And what I mean is, you go through this, you get to black belt, and you go back to awareness, and you go back to mechanics, and then dynamics and waves, and you do it again. And let me tell you, I've done it. There's a lot of things that I know that I now know that I used to not know. And so I'm pretty sure that there's more things that I don't know right now that I don't know. And I'm totally fine with the current state of that, and I also have found a way to make each of these phases quite enjoyable and sort of reinforcing to itself, so that the awareness phase is fascinating instead of frustrating, and the mechanics phase is an opportunity to be immersed instead of a task of repetitive drilling. And that the dynamics is not this sort of overwhelming, oh, I can't make sense of all these movements, but rather, how can I bridge this area with this area? They seem unrelated, but they must be related to each other, and what links them together. And then brown belt is sort of this this sense where you are going with a resisting person, and you can, this will sound crazy, you can almost know what they want to do before they know they should probably do that. Not what they are going to do, but what they want to do. They want to do all these different things, and they're going to do one of them at best. And you sort of leave the promise that they could happen open to them, so they might pick any one of these paths to go down, but in reality, you sort of set a different trap at each one, or you've set one trap that captures all of them regardless of which path they choose. And so you can shift your framing or perspective of each of these stages in a way that makes each cycle through that much more enjoyable, or allows for it to be reinforced in a way that is not frustrating, like I said, but rather very rewarding. And I thought I might share all this with you because you're likely, if you do Jiu-Jitsu, almost certainly in one of these stages here, and it's a good idea to have a vision of where you might be headed, what you might have accomplished up to this point, and maybe want to revisit if you're not quite comfortable with the level of sophistication you've gotten to. And then know that you're going to return to these same senses. You're going to return to a sense of, well, I don't really know how this entire set of attacks works, but I know the process to use to learn it, and that's going to be a good time. And so by having these different layers of analysis, we're able to not only move forward in our own practice and our own study, but then to help bring others with us by encouraging them to immerse themselves in whatever level they happen to be on. And when their own awareness or mechanics or dynamics are prepared, they will inevitably move into the next stage. And really the long-term goal is everyone is a black belt, and everyone has a very useful set of tools to improve their own jiu-jitsu, and then in that way improve the jiu-jitsu of everyone that they're with, and then in that way to move beyond improving just jiu-jitsu into improving our general existence, or our general ability to engage with each other. And that's all I'll have for this one.